Your support helps us bring you programs you love. Go to wyomingpbs.org, click on Support, and become a sustaining member or an annual member. It's easy and secure. Thank you.
Welcome to the final week of Capital Outlook for the 2019 legislative session on Wyoming PBS. I'm Craig Blumenshine. Thank you so much for joining us. It's our last here in the temporary Capitol here in the Jonah Building. We begin tonight with a good discussion with Wyoming's 33rd governor. That's Governor Mark Gordon. And we follow that with discussions with the leadership of the Wyoming legislature, both from the majority and the minority parties. We'll couple that with a profile of Representative Dan Kirkbride, and that'll be a wrap then for us here in Cheyenne. Capital Outlook starts now.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.
And as we begin our final Capital Outlook for this legislative session, it's our privilege to be joined by Wyoming's Governor, Mark Gordon. Governor, welcome.
Well, thanks. It's great to be here.
We're filming this on Thursday morning, and at 2 a.m. this morning, you addressed the legislature. How many times have you yawned today?
Oh, not too many. I went home. I have my grandson, and so, it just kind of refreshed me, realized why you were doing all this.
You were here, obviously, for the entire session, your first session. We've asked the leadership, we'll follow in a segment with their discussion about what they believe the legacy of this legislature is. What's your view on the work of this legislature?
Well, I think it was a phenomenal legislature. We began with the first bill signing recognizing Women's Suffrage Day on December 10th. And that sort of set the stage for the collaborative work that we did during the session. I was particularly excited because I got to work with some really great legislators. And over the last couple of days, just this morning, we were signing pieces of legislation that are really important, impactful pieces of legislation. The veterans' home. There were pieces of legislation that had to do with making sure people didn't, pass buses on. And so what I said this morning when I closed the session is it was an honor to work with this legislature. What was particularly exciting is that there were a number of freshman bills that the freshmen said I could go to senior legislators. They helped me craft this. Both houses worked on the pieces of legislation. So I said, young, old, freshman, seasoned, Republican, Democrat, man, woman, this legislature worked together and did some really good work.
There were many, many issues that this legislature talked about, one of which was its supplemental budget, that you kind of stepped in a little bit during the session, asking the two bodies to work better together, is how I took from some reporting. Were they able to do that?
Oh, I think they were. I think leadership makes all the difference, and I'm not taking credit for that leadership. I think it was a collaborative effort on all of our parts. There were times when people felt like, oh, things are coming off the rails, you need to worry about that. It's a credit to the Speaker and the President that they were able to keep things on track. It made my job working with them that much easier. This morning and last night, actually, just a real spirit of camaraderie between all of us to get to the finish.
But Wyoming still has some tough issues in front of it.
Absolutely.
You said in your inaugural address that we in Wyoming are not eager to take on new taxes, and especially so if we have not done our best to control expenditures. You have not presented your own first budget. You'll do that now, coming in November. But you have a sense now of where Wyoming is relative to its fiscal health. Has it done its best to control its expenditures, in your view?
I think there's more to do.
And where?
Well, I spoke a little bit about capital construction projects. I spoke a little bit about not getting too far out in front of our skis. This, of course, was Governor Mead's budget. We added a couple of aspects to it that I think are important: weed control and the Veterans Center and a couple of other things like that. we have more work to do. I think there's some efficiencies we can bring. I still am going to work to collaborate and do a better job of synchronizing our economic development efforts. I think we have some more work to do there, and I'll have the chance to do that with our budget.
Majority Floor Leader Barlow and the Senate's leader, Senator Dockstader, last week on our show said that, and especially Representative Barlow phrased it this way: Wyoming has policy wants and Wyoming has policy needs. And we need to have the discussion about which is which. And it's going to take a strong executive to help us along, paraphrasing there. What is your role now, and how do you plan to include normal Wyomingites in Wyoming's future?
Well, I've always been very engaged and get around the state as much as I possibly can, as you know, Craig, how much I enjoy this state, top to bottom, east to west. It is a phenomenal state, and I listen very carefully to what people say. I've had, I believe, a very successful legislative session in being able to engage with this legislature to really talk about what we want to do with policy moving forward. And I guess at the end of the day, I think we're going to be very transparent, and I think we'll be able to bring a good, robust discussion. Just take a look at economic development. We're restructuring the way the Business Council is doing its work. I had a conversation about Endow, and I said, look, let's make sure that this economically needed diversification options for Wyoming program really has a purpose that's well defined and stated. You know, I want it to help to outline what our future should look like and to give us options, not directions. But for example, one of the things I said is, let's take a look at taxes. What do our taxes look like? And let's compare them to North Dakota or Kentucky, other conservative states, and see what happens if we lose our coal production, if we have a change in the gas production, if we see more wind production. What do these things do to our economy, so that we can talk about this really forward-looking as opposed to, you know, 1 year at a time.
You've read the studies that have talked about, in fact, when you were treasurer, the studies came across your desk that talked about Wyoming's current energy-dependent tax structure. To expand on that a little bit, and that economic diversification, which is very important to you, will worsen the state's fiscal woes. So coupling all that together, does that make these discussions more critical at this time, or can it be a 3 to 5 year process that Representative Barlow talked about last week?
Yeah, I think it is a 3 to 5 year process. It's something my administration really is going to take up very seriously. And as I said, you know, what we tend to do is we tend to look at session by session, and how do we make sure we don't raise taxes? How do we make sure that we keep our spending in control? And that's all very good on a very short term, kind of horizon. What's important, I think, is to understand where we want to be in 3 to 5 years, what the potentials could be should we see different scenarios. But my point is that people in Wyoming are smart. They understand what's at stake, and I think if we have a better understanding, one of the things I called for that Superintendent Balo and I have worked on is how do we make the state's budgeting process more transparent? How do we get our high schools involved? We're working together on a curriculum to do that, and I think that's going to be part of this discussion. You know, I was a little bit disappointed this year that we didn't think about how we broaden our revenue sources. We are still very much at the whim of commodity prices, but that'll come.
I want to challenge you a little bit there, because this legislature did think about it in the aspect of they considered a lodging tax, they considered the National Retail Fairness Act. Neither of those bills, about $60 million worth of revenue, give or take, involved in those bills, didn't make it to your desk. So there is discussion, but there are these walls that prevent really serious discussion from forwarding it. That said, what was your take on the lodging tax bill, and what was your take on the National Retail Fairness Act?
Well, I said during the campaign, and I felt that the lodging tax was something that the industry had brought forward. I think it was building a certain amount of, support behind it, a logic to it. And when it started to look like it might be successful, then it became more of a Christmas tree. people started loading more and more things on it, and it lost its way a bit. And I think the discipline of saying, if we are going to do a revenue source, we've got to think very carefully about it. We've got to make sure it goes through in a clean way. That's important. The retail throwback tax was a much more complicated story. It was trying to find a niche that was hard to explain. It certainly talked about an income tax, which is something that nobody in Wyoming ever wants to do. And it was really trying to put a very technical kind of argument together. I think it had challenges really from the start. I'm amazed it had the support it did. I do feel badly that the House kind of extended their neck a bit. Nobody in the House really wanted to do that. They felt like they had the momentum to do it, and yet the Senate kind of cut them off at the pass.
Would you have supported it?
I think it still had a lot of challenges to work through. It was hard to understand. There were some unclear aspects to it. One of the examples was Xanterra, which is the Yellowstone Park concessionaire, wouldn't have had taxes to pay, but Grand Teton Lodge Company would have had. And trying to explain why that's all fair and stuff was
maybe some work to do with that?
A lot more to do with that particular bill. And it sort of came out of, it hadn't gone through its normal, sort of legislative process beforehand. Yeah.
I want to turn the page a little bit. You talked a lot in your campaign about local control,
right,
and how important local control is. Yet here comes Senate File 49 to your desk, and I'm speaking of the bill that would remove county zoning when planning the construction or expansion of private schools. It's a Teton County issue.
Right.
It's on your desk.
It is.
A, are you going to sign it? And B, is that contrary to what you campaigned about?
Yeah, I think, let me put it this way. I am still thinking very carefully about this bill. As you point out, and I do feel very strongly about this, this is a local control issue. The circumstances around this particular set of issues, I think brought the legislature in a big way to talk about this because it was Teton County. I think the implications for other counties are pretty severe. I've been talking with the county commissioners and saying, how do we, because this was about Teton County. This was about Teton County did, foster freeze wrong. At least that's the way the issue was kind of laid out, and Foster just wanted to be able to build a school, and there were some technical pieces to that. The unintended consequences of this, I think, aren't well understood. And so regardless of whether I sign it or not, it is my intent to work with the county commission, because at this point, it's only the counties that are affected by this. The towns can still put the same zoning requirements on. And so my intent here is to work with the county commission and the towns to make sure that we have a sensible approach to what local control should be.
We have about 45 seconds left, Governor. Two things I want to get to. You were at the White House earlier this week.
Yep.
What governors did you visit with and become friends with?
Brad Little, governor of Idaho, and I have become good friends. Governor Nome from South Dakota. There's a lot of good governors, particularly around this area. I did have a little bit of a dust-up with Governor Inslee of Washington. Governor Inslee is talking a lot about carbon sequestration, or basically, we need to have all renewables, and we're raising sea level and all that sort of thing. I brought him straight, I felt, talking about, look, let's solve the problem. Let's not, politicize it.
Governor, this is our last interview in the Jonah building. Gonna miss this place? You can be honest.
No, not really. I think it's going to be exciting to be back in the Capitol. This has certainly sufficed. This is the first time I've really had an office here. It was a little hard to be between two different offices. But I think one of the nicest things about going back to the Capitol, when we first moved in here, as you know, Craig, there's glass between the galleries and the chambers. and I always referred to that as, you know, sort of a sneeze guard. And I'm glad
a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah. so I'm glad that the salad, you know, the thing protecting the salad is going away, and we will have that kind of straightforward connection.
I think a lot of people, a lot of Wyomingites will look forward to July, Governor, when the new Capitol is the refurbished Capitol is dedicated and will be open for business.
It'll be exciting. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you so much for joining us, Governor. It's always a pleasure to visit with you.
Always a pleasure.
On to our next segment here in Capitol Outlook. Now, with the majority leadership, that's the Speaker of the House, Steve Harshman, and President of the Senate, Drew Perkins. That's next. And we continue in week 8, our final week here in the Jonah building of Capitol Outlook, with Senate President Drew Perkins and the Speaker of the House, Steve Harshman. Gentlemen, thanks again for coming.
We're glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
What's the legacy of this legislature? What would you tell me?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think, you know, President Perkins and I think and myself, we really worked closely together. I think it's been really, you know, our system is bicameralism, right? It's 2 houses, and I think we've just diligently worked to push and improve things for our people. It's been an honor to serve, and I think we've done a lot of good stuff. Criminal justice reform is probably the biggest thing of the session that has totally flown under the radar. I think there's lots of education bills, from our CTE and the Hathaway to the K3 reading and many others, virtual education. I think the opioid task force is important. But I think, and I'll stop, but the thing that kind of had sucked all the air out of the room was all this budget talk, and really what we were talking about was less than 1% of our budget. And all that work, that's what bicameral legislatures do, and you don't agree and you come together, and we were within 200,000 of each other. So in the end, it all worked out. The process really works.
Mr. President, what is the legacy of this legislature?
I think the legacy is, in one word, quite successful. Well, that's 2 words, I guess. Quite successful. In addition to what the Speaker said, you know, I think the you know, the damper was some stuff about the lodging tax and the National Retail Fairness Act, and those things took away from what I think. There's some really good legislation that came through the session. We both have quite a few, you know, we don't have as many years of experience as some of the most senior members of our group, but there's been some of the best legislation I've seen in quite a few years, and there's some legislation that's going to make a difference for Wyoming. The ones that the Speaker talked of, but there's some others. There's just off the top of my head, there was it's not a earth-changing bill, but provides a real lot of dignity. There was one about there's a bill that came in and treats the biological evidence that's taken from sexual assault victims, and treats it with some dignity and respect that people deserve. What they have to go through to have that collected, and that was you know, that was just a great, wonderful bill. There was a simple one of the just resolution to acknowledge women's suffrage, a great celebration of Wyoming, and we look forward to having that. We have, I mean, even the U.S. Senate has a resolution with respect to Suffrage Day and recognize Wyoming's part in that. In addition to that, there were a suite of blockchain bills that came through that pushed that envelope down the line. We have people who are coming to look at moving operations and headquarters to Casper because of things not Casper, Wyoming. I don't think they'll be in Casper, wouldn't be my guess, but looking at Wyoming to kick the tires and see if they're ready to move here because of what we've done with blockchain and the advances we've made there. We've done great things on trust. The Chancery Court bill is passed both houses now. We've got gosh, there are some just great pieces of legislation that have gone through. They're going to make a difference for Wyoming. We're working, well, hopefully we can get the housing bill passed for the, we've got to get that to a conference committee. It's getting to a conference committee, the housing for UW, which will change the face of UW, create 2,000 replacement beds for students to be there, which is the #1 priority of that university. There's a lot of things that have been done here to move the state forward. And when people are going to reflect back, and I think people are reflecting back, it's been a very successful legislative session.
I do want to visit The budget did take the air out of this session a little bit, but so did the revenue bills that you considered. And I do want to talk about those a little bit. You two disagreed in the end on lodging tax. That's one bill that many thought that would move forward in this legislature. And both of you talked repeatedly about the need for Wyoming to modernize its tax structure. That was a major emphasis at the start of the session. And big hurdles for this legislature. Mr. Speaker, those bills start with you. What is the mood going forward with Wyoming's revenue needs relative to revenue bills?
Well, I think our revenue needs, I think for the meantime, I think obviously we cross our fingers and hope for good oil prices. Wyoming oil near 60, and we'll be in good shape, I think, and strong investment returns. And and I think that'll happen. We're hopeful, we really are. And so, but those things are a little bit out of our control. And I think the ideas that came forward, probably, I think the House probably killed 20 revenue ideas and sent 2 across, really. And we're like every other state. You try to do things where the least impact your people. So lodging tax, sales tax, those all affect everybody in the state of Wyoming. But these ideas, we're really already paying this, I call it an apportionment, really, with this national retail fairness. And but it's an idea, I think the people will drive this right across the state. And as they learn more and as we get out in our committees, we'll just keep working on these issues and the people will drive it. But I thought, instead of raising a property tax, I think the House and many senators, instead of raising a property tax on grandma or minerals or business or the homeowner, there's a way to recapture some of those things that it's already apportioned in our products. The other piece, the lodging tax that left the House. And the reason, I think, again, like every state, you try to have non-residents pay most of those bills. That's 80 to 85% is paid by out-of-staters and really non-American citizens who visit our national parks. Half the tax is collected in Teton County. So, I think those ideas are close. They'll probably stick around a while, but I think we'll send our revenue off with some work to kind of look at that. I think we got to continue to kind of ask what kind of state we want in the future, because we are attracting certain groups of people with our tax structure. And I think it'd be a good exercise to, how does Montana tax people? How does North Dakota and South Dakota, states that are similar to us, to pay their bills? And so I think we're not the first legislature, the 65th, to ever deal with this issue, and we won't be the last. So I think it's just an ongoing process.
Mr. President, those 2 bills, about $65 million worth of revenue, perhaps, estimated, came your way, and the Senate decided that now's not the time. So the question is that when you look at the future and you look at those, how to study, what else do we need to learn, and how do we need to learn it?
Well, I think when you do that, part of it is simply education, both education of the public as well as education of legislators. I personally worked hard to try and get the votes I needed to get the National Retail Fairness Act out and successfully passed through the Senate. I got close, but I didn't quite get there. I think that as I talked with people individually about what that bill did, the response in the end was, yeah, why wouldn't we do that? Wyoming citizens are already paying this. These are, when you look, if you go back in our history, these national chains weren't here 30 years ago, and they are here now. And in their national pricing structure, we're already paying this. This is such a not even a blip on the radar. It would not affect prices on a national scale. And so, if we can get past some of the reservations that you've heard in the Senate were about disparate. So I think we can go back and look at that. There may be some ways to resolve the nature of that, and calm some of those fears. But it was a great effort. Representative Obermuller just had worked his tail off on that, and he was excellent. He was right on so many parts of that, and I don't think it's over. I think it's just the beginning.
I want to ask you both. Do you both believe without tax reform that economic diversification hurts our state if we're not going to be successful in having tax reform?
Yeah, I think, that debate is, and our former Representative Madden would always point to the numbers on that, because you have to provide those services. And whether it's county, city, your hospitals, your schools, and so on. And I think it's a little bit of a chicken or an egg question. And for me, the answer is probably a little both. I mean, I think you got to have a little economic development, but you also got to work on the other side too.
As you diversify a tax base, you have to diversify in order to take advantage of a diversified economy. But ultimately, if you're not careful about it, you can discourage the diversification of your economy by your tax policy. You know, I think the other thing is important. If you look about this whole issue, if you go to Alaska, they're looking at 25% budget cuts. That state is much more dependent on oil and gas energy revenues than Wyoming is. But there's a little bit of a cautionary tale in that at some point in time, we have to continue to work to diversify. We've got more diverse revenue streams than Alaska does, but that's a cautionary tale about where we need to be looking at in the future.
Mr. President, 2 weeks ago we talked about an investigation with Senator Lynn Hutchings. Do you have an update for us?
The only update I can give you is we've confirmed with the Wyoming Equality it remains an informal complaint, and so I think that it may very well be referred to a subcommittee of Management Council to see if they believe anything else should be different done. The subcommittee will be the senators who serve on Management Council, but the process remains confidential in accordance with our rules, and we trust the process and we'll work the process.
Is it accurate to say the investigation's ongoing?
Well, I don't know to have an investigation. I think the facts of what was said and how it was said and where it was said, I think those are uncontested by both sides. And so what you're looking at is some other issues and looking how it conforms with Senate rules and of decorum, and we'll see what if anything can be done. I just reiterate that regardless of where people believe, people believe all kinds of things about that, but when you're elected to the legislature or any other office, you don't leave your First Amendment rights alone. They come with you, and you have the right to express yourself. So the question is there a decorum? Is there some other rule that's been violated? Because we don't have a rule against exercising your First Amendment right.
Lastly, on that issue, you told us 2 weeks ago that the public may learn of the results of or any conclusions that might be drawn if Wyoming Equality gives you permission to do that. Have they given you any permission at all?
No, they have not.
Okay. Well, to you both, it's a pleasure to visit with you each week. I think our public appreciates it. I've told you both, I think that many press folks don't have the availability, and I'm not talking just about us, but my colleagues on radio, in online media, and in print, that you give them as far as access is concerned. That availability is much appreciated. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and to all your staff, it's been great. And and I just kind of close and what Senator Perkins is talking about is a citizen legislature. It's a classic that in 7 weeks, we've worked very hard to represent our people, accomplish more work than any other legislature in the country in a shorter time. And I think as a citizen legislature, I mean, just in the House of Representatives, I got 3 folks who are battling cancer while they're on the floor. One's buried his mother, another is taking care of his mother, another who is gravely ill, another whose father had a stroke. I mean, all these things are life like the rest of Wyoming's living, and we're going to leave here and go back to work Friday. And so we appreciate the opportunity to serve, but I think the Wyoming legislature is a great institution. And we just keep working this process and honoring it, and it'll serve our state well and our people well.
You have the last word, Mr. President.
I just reiterate that it's you come down here, and whether it's this year or another year, I've had grandchildren born during the legislature. I had my father-in-law died during the legislative session. This year we've had a brother-in-law die. We've had Senator rush out because of health issues in their family. We've had broken teeth. We've had flu. We've had colds. All that stuff goes on down here, and most of us will be back at our own jobs either Monday or Tuesday next week.
Speaking of flu, we're glad you're feeling better.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
On to the next segment of Capital Outlook. Before the session started, we visited with Representative Dan Kirkbride at his Chugwater Ranch home. That's next. Stay with us. It's our pleasure now to be joined by Representative Dan Kirkbride, who served Converse and Platte County since 2013 on this Capital Outlook profile. Representative, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for coming out and spending some time with me.
We're in your beautiful home. We've got a beautiful view of this part of Wyoming. You've lived here a long time, a fourth-generation cattle rancher.
Yes, I've been here 36 years, and my family came in the 19th century to Wyoming from England. So.
And were they sheep ranchers to start? Is that...
You know, actually, they came and got jobs with some of their neighbors from England who had come to this country a few years before. And so then they got homesteads and started in, and probably started out with sheep as much as anything, yes.
And now you run cattle?
All cattle, yes.
And it's still a family operation?
Still a family operation. There's 10 of us involved, and I'm kind of the satellite ranch. The other guys are down in northern Laramie County, would be the main operation.
Representative, you were, prior to serving in the legislature, you were a county commissioner.
Yes.
Why did you start public service? What motivated you to serve? And
you know, it was something I always thought I would do. Even as a young man, I just thought someday I'll run for something. I probably thought school board would be one of the things I'd done, which I haven't done. When my kids were that age, I was too busy to be on school board, following the kids. Mm-hmm. And then as I got older and nearer where I might launch into something like that, you know, I'd see people making decisions and I'd think, well, I could make those decisions. So finally at about age 50, I ran for commissioner.
You enjoy that time?
8-year stint there. Yeah, I really did enjoy it. That's important work, and it kind of dovetailed nicely with the ranching, you know, where you'd have 2 meetings a month and you could sort of plan for them, and not the one big block of time like you have at the legislature.
It's year-round. I mean, you've been chairman of an important committee that mm-hmm. Has done a lot of heavy lifting in the interim and will likely continue to do more. Is that problematic for what you want to do here with the ranch, or is it been able to work well for you?
No, actually, my son has come back here in the last year to sort of phase in while I phase out a little on the ranch. So I probably have more time than I've ever had, which will be nice.
What made you run for the legislature?
You know, I had good experience as a commissioner, and then I actually lost my election in 10 and sat out a couple of years, and then there was an opening. Representative Peasley from Douglas decided not to run, so this seat was open, and you know how that always gets people's interest. And so I decided, well, here's a chance to get my oar in the water on something like that. So
this is a big district. I mean, we're near Chugwater, where you live. It goes clear up to Douglas.
About 85 miles from north to south. Yes.
Areas in between. Is it hard for you to stay in touch with all your constituents then?
Well, I'm not just at everything. It would probably be helpful if I lived in one of the population centers, you know, Wheatland or Douglas. I could be a little more visible, but there's an awful lot of stuff done with email and phone calls.
And you maintain a social media presence. You work hard to keep your constituents up to date. That way, it appears to me.
Got a Facebook page, yes. My wife coaches me on that.
Is that odd for you to be in that game?
A little bit.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You were a journalism major.
Yes.
In school, you would think it'd be easy, right? Just pop off those posts and be done. And
you know, I think there's something about, I see the guys at the legislature who are maybe 40 and younger, they just think in those terms more than I do. So I don't get as much good out of it probably as some of the younger guys do, but it's a good tool.
You've been a writer in the past also.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, president of Wyoming Writers, Inc. at one time.
Right.
Is that a hobby of yours, would you say?
Yes. I never worked a lot professionally as a journalist after I got out of college, but I always had a lot of fun writing. In particular, in the late 80s and early 90s, I wrote a monthly human interest column in Farm and Ranch newspapers that I just really enjoyed doing it, probably. I enjoyed more than the readers, but that might get back to that again someday.
We're in your beautiful home. We are near Chugwater, so I've got to ask the question. You ever entered the Chugwater Chili Cook-Off?
No. My main input for the cook-off has been as a judge.
Yeah.
I get to be a judge every now and then. That's fun.
One of the things that you've talked about on your social media page and as you've been campaigning through the years is you view yourself as a moderate conservative. And to some folks, those words may not go together. Where does that fit in your philosophy?
It's just how I'm wired, Craig. I just look at both sides of an issue. Sometimes I'm, probably not just sometimes, a lot of times I'm for the underdog. And I just, I've always had the approach that you try to come up with a fair solution to a problem and not oppress the loser in the process, and maybe come up with something that they live with and get people to work together. And that's been my approach to life and politics, really.
You've been in a legislature that maybe in the House, up until this point, has become a little more conservative. Has that been problematic in trying to negotiate and work your way through tough issues that kind of are heavy to lift?
It's an interesting flavor that being county commissioner didn't have. County commissioner was much more of a nonpartisan effort. And then I got in the legislature and suddenly it's more partisan. And before you run, you know, you fill out all the questionnaires all summer long. Different groups want to know where you stand on things. More partisan. There's just been a conservative bloc in the House the 6 years I've been there of 15 to 20 voters that kind of held together in a tight position. And a lot of times I vote with them, but not always. And then, of course, about 8 to 10 Democrats at the other end of the spectrum. So.
You've mentioned before there's almost 3 groups.
There's almost 3 groups. I would agree with that.
And so you use also a football field as a metaphor for where you stand.
Yes, I've always said that I see the philosophical treasure houses in the end zone, and I live at about the 25-yard line.
So not at the 50.
Not at the 50, but somewhere out there in the 25 to 30. Of Republican thinking, yes.
You've taken on the chairmanship of the Judicial Committee.
Mm-hmm.
You enjoyed that?
I really have enjoyed it. I've learned a lot of just about the whole field of the judiciary and criminal justice and correction system, family law. So tremendous education at my stage of life to learn a lot about something new. And then I've enjoyed the process. We work with important bills. We've had a good committee, both the House and Senate members, and got some really good things done, particularly in this last session of the legislature in early 18.
You've worried this interim on the long-term fiscal health of the correction system. And I guess the question is the way we do things in Wyoming relative to corrections sustainable with our economy as it is?
I think some changes would be very healthy for us, but in order to make them, we need to spend some money up front. That seems to be a bit of a barrier, but in a nutshell, we've looked at some criminal justice reform measures where you spend your money on treatment for people rather than on incarceration for people.
And I know that you've talked about that in this interim a lot. Can Wyoming do that successfully given the state's somewhat large and massive geography where services, mental health services in particular, aren't equally available all across the state?
That's one of the drawbacks to it, that a prisoner coming out of the system goes back to his little hometown and there isn't the access to mental health that, unless he happens to live in Cheyenne or Casper or Sheridan or somewhere. So that's one of the things we try to, we're working on, we're overcoming. We've got the Department of Family Services people in the Labor and Health Committee are collaborating on some solutions to that. But yeah, that's part of the equation.
We're visiting before the session has started, airing this during the session, of course, but the state has seen some somewhat more positive revenue projections. You have said maybe that will then allow this legislature and maybe a couple that will follow to kick the can down the road a little bit farther relative to a serious look at Wyoming's future relative to its revenues. Does that concern you?
It does concern me because I think one of the things you're elected to have is some vision about what's coming. And we can probably get through 5 years in pretty good shape almost no matter what happens. What about 10 years from now? Where will we be? And the industry people themselves say that the coal and the natural gas industries it's a new normal for them. So we're right now pinning a lot of our hopes on oil and a strong stock market, but I don't know if that's enough to take us into the future and provide the services that we need in the state that people want, and take good care of our responsibilities.
I've read that you've used the metaphor of a tree project to describe what it is that you do. That you say that it nicely parallels your legislative involvement. You and your wife will not see the trees grow to their true fruition, but you plant them so that they'll be strong and tall in places for decades to come. Do you think that we're visionary enough to really look at things long-term, or are there short-term barriers that really prevent us from doing what you just talked about?
You know, I hope we can at least begin to have more of those discussions, particularly regarding the financial picture of the state and revenue. We just, the old way that worked so well for us for, what, 5 or 6 decades is just not what it was. It's a new deal. What the statistics were that in 2006, minerals were supplying 67% of the state's revenue. In 2017, they were supplying 52%. So I think we need to just have that discussion about what this is going to be like in the future. And we've done a lot of cutting, and cutting's good, and we've tried to find efficiencies. We're still working on that. But I don't know that that's the whole answer to the problem.
You sponsored a year ago House Bill 176, Tax Reform 2020 Committee is what the bill was titled. Mm-hmm. Along those same lines, yet it never saw the light of day. Why is it such a hard and difficult discussion?
I think people get nervous when you even bring that subject up, that it's somehow code words for a state income tax. Mm-hmm. And that makes them nervous, and it makes all the legislators nervous that if they somehow come across as a proponent of that they're going to have a difficult opponent at the next election. But I think you can have the discussion. When they had the discussion in 2000, and they had one of the most fine conservative statesmen the state's probably ever had in Senator Hines from Campbell County, was the chairman. I've got a list somewhere in my office of like a dozen different concepts that later worked their way into the system, and I think there's probably some fruit like that to be had where we'd have that discussion again. We would involve some people beyond the legislature on a task force like that that would have some good input. I think it's a valuable thing. I'll bring the bill and see what they do with it, and if it doesn't fly, maybe bring it again and call it Revenue Reform 2022. You know,
it'll step through. So the question becomes, can Wyoming ever get away from boom and bust?
I think we can do better. I don't know if we can get away from it. We're a natural resource state. We're pretty comfortable with that for the most part.
One of the gubernatorial candidates said that that's what we are. That's a hand we've been dealt. Let's deal with it. Mm-hmm. Is that a good attitude? Is that the right attitude?
I'd like to try working on that first and having that discussion about what that would look like, were we to try to redistribute, I guess is probably the word, of how we fund the state.
Representative Kirkbride, we are very thankful that you've graciously allowed us to come into your home today, and we really appreciate this time that you spent with us on this Capital Outlook profile.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. I enjoyed the visit.
And as we now conclude the final week of Capital Outlook here in Cheyenne, it's our pleasure to be joined again by the minority floor leaders of the Wyoming House and the Senate, Representative Cathy Connolly and Senator Chris Rothfuss. Welcome to you both.
Hi, well, thank you. Good to be back.
We were here 7 weeks ago, right? And a lot of talk about ability to diversify our economy, ability to modernize our tax structure. What's the legacy of this legislature? Representative Connolly, you can start first.
All right, I'll start. I do sit on the Revenue Committee, and so that honestly, we were tasked with that during the interim as well as this session, and regrettably, we didn't do much in that regard at all. And so, admittedly, I'm a bit disappointed. We had a lodging tax proposal to go through, and then a proposal that would have kind of instituted a very narrow corporate income tax. We didn't pass either of those, and those would have really helped to kind of begin that first step.
She was talking about $60 million of tax bills that came your way, Senator, and either either in committee or on the floor in the case of lodging tax, didn't make its way through.
Well, it's unfortunate, and it just shows how challenging it is to actually diversify the revenue picture in the state of Wyoming. We honestly did some decent work to diversify the economy. I think the blockchain bills we passed were excellent. We did some other work that I think will be helpful. But the reality is, if we diversify the economy without diversifying that revenue structure, it'll hurt the state instead of help the state. And at this point in time, we're really behind the 8 ball. We made no progress this session.
So we asked the majority leadership the same question. You just talked about it. You both believe, I assume, that without tax reform, economic diversification hurts the state of Wyoming. What's the path forward?
We have to continue to do that hard work. It is honestly, I think, frustrating for the minority party, for lots of us, regardless of party, that we're not willing to kind of get it to the end line, to have those conversations without the knee-jerk reaction about any kind of what would be considered taxation, fee increases, indexing of already existing fees and taxes. We have to have those conversations, or like you said, it really makes no difference to bring in a new company.
And as you know, those conversations have happened, and they've happened again, and they've happened again. Senator, the roadblock's still there.
I think the biggest thing is the education piece and trying to communicate with the general public about what our revenue picture looks like, what would happen if we diversify the economy, what the long-term projections are for the state. The difficult aspect of that is it takes all of us. It takes the entire legislature, not just Cathy and I talking to our districts, but the rest of the legislators that are willing to speak up and have that conversation. Unfortunately, they don't feel comfortable in that conversation, and so the difficulty of overcoming that hurdle when there's an unwillingness to even talk about it is incredibly challenging.
Yeah, I'd like to just add on to that, because it seems like the rhetoric is still at the place that we can cut. And that's what we need to do. We don't need to think about kind of increasing revenue streams or even diversification of the revenue streams that we have right now, but that we need to kind of cut government. And honestly, we have cut government to the bone and services to the bone that I think honestly makes us less attractive for economic diversification. We need to have not only kind of good infrastructure in terms of roads and bridges and broadband, but we need to invest in people. We need to have kind of good social services for our neighbors. We do a good job in education. I honestly hate that we're constantly needing to defend that, but we also need to expand that to think about kind of our aging population, our families with disabilities. Everyone has somebody kind of in their family, in their neighborhood that has kind of challenges that we as a state need to step up and take care of that. That makes us a kind of a better place to move to, but it also costs money, and we need to invest in our people in that kind of way.
The Senate's Majority Floor Leader, Senator Dockstader, was here last week saying that, you know what, where we still can cut, not today, they don't want us to do it today, but they've told us in time there's still room to cut in education.
Well, I've served on education for the entire time I've been in the legislature, and I just find that inaccurate. There's no room to cut unless you want to cut quality. We can cut quality. If we cut quality, we can save money. But you can't maintain the excellence of education we have right now and cut education at the same time. So there's no question we can cut any of our programs if we don't want quality programs in their place. If the people are willing to say mediocre is great in education, then we can make those cuts. But I'm certainly not willing to make that choice.
And we could even invest more. We absolutely know that an investment in early childhood education is good for kids, it's good for families, and honestly, it's good for economics down the road with less cost for special education.
Majority Floor Leader of the House, Representative Barlow, last week talked to us about policy wants and policy needs and his thoughts about going forward in identifying the difference. How should that discussion, both Senator Dockstader and Representative Barlow talked about the need for a strong executive to be part of that process. How does that discussion evolve in Wyoming? How does that communication follow?
I'm excited about a new governor and to see the kind of leadership of a new governor. I mean, we're just beginning. I mean, he's only been on the job for 2 months. And we have, in fact, did the Senate today do kind of the decisions regarding agency heads?
We did,
and
yep,
so,
we did confirmations,
right,
good people.
New Department of Health, Department of Family Services, kind of existing people and some of the other big, right, that, all right, we're ready to sit down and start working with the governor and his agency heads on a new direction.
There are some social issues that both of you have spoke about in the past. Give us an update, because I have a feeling you're going to tell us not much progress was made. Non-discrimination laws that came before the legislature.
Yeah, we could have done better. I mean, we passed that bill out of the House committee, but it wasn't heard on the floor. That was incredibly frustrating to me, that we did not even have that discussion or debate.
We heard from both freshmen, a Republican and a Democrat, about how important this is for young people especially. Senator, how does that move forward, or does it? Or can it?
We'll keep pushing and it will move forward. I have no doubt that we'll win on that one. It's just a matter of when. The reality is, if we want to diversify the economy, if we want to be a state that is seen as open for business, equality in the workplace is considered to be an essential component. So we can't have a serious conversation about moving forward into the 21st century in our workplace, in our industry, without accomplishing that objective.
Yeah. I mean, the former governor, and actually now Governor Gordon, is keeping Endow, and there's a youth group meaning a kind of a engage, right? That, and it was their #1 priority, you know, giving advice to the state. What is it that you need to do? I mean, they didn't talk about broadband. They talked about non-discrimination as making Wyoming a more friendly place to attract companies like theirs.
On to another issue, wealth inequality. You talked about that on the floor, Representative.
So today, and I'm very proud that the House on the 3rd reading defeated the bill that had a work requirement for Medicaid and SNAP recipients. It would have been, I think, less than 100 people ultimately that it would have impacted. We have wealth disparity in this state, and that we're honestly not addressing it, in my mind, well enough. You know, we heard about, and of course we know about in each and every one of our communities, if not among ourselves, homelessness, poverty. We talked about what happens when kids kind of just age out of the foster care system. We need to step up.
The Medicaid work requirement passed out of your body, Senator.
Yeah, the Medicaid work requirement, honestly, that's one of those policies that really does just hurt the state, and there are people who advocate for it, and they think somehow it's going to help. But the idea that we need to focus on the poorest and figure out ways to make their lives even more difficult when we have all the challenges that we have, it's just piling on, and it's unnecessary policy. We need to find ways to support that community better, to make sure that when they have the opportunity to get back into the workplace, they can, rather than punishing them for not. It's exactly the reverse of the policies we should be moving forward with and trying to promote.
Medicaid aside, has this legislature at all set any foundation to move the needle for better access to health care and mental health services for all Wyoming citizens?
We had 2 policies. The first is mental health parity, a nice piece of legislation passed, and it's been years in the making, which ensures that insurance providers cannot treat, if they're choosing to offer mental health coverage, they cannot treat the mental health coverage in a different way from traditional health care coverage that they offer. So that's a really good bill that did come out of this session. And then the other one that I'm excited about is a piece of legislation on air ambulances, where we know that a lot of people end up bankrupt because they end up with life flight and flying a short distance, but for $50,000, $75,000 that their insurance won't cover all of if they have insurance. We know bankruptcies arise from that, and it's a nice piece of legislation that helps to address that as well. So to me, those are 2 positive steps we took in healthcare.
For each of you, your highest priority in the interim now becomes, I'll start with you first, Rosie.
Oh, interesting. We're just finishing up today, and so it's hard to think about the future. However, it has been on my mind that in my committee work, right, which will be revenue and education, I really want to push us continuing to have the conversation about taxation and revenue streams in general, as opposed to kind of looking at very narrow topics. That's not going to get us into the future by looking at, what's missing and what can we just capture here or there. I want that broader conversation. Similarly on education, I'd like to go back to kind of talking about early childhood education. But it's interesting that you had just talked about the wealth inequality issue. A couple of things I want kind of on a kind of personal level that I'll just then bring out into kind of all of the other work I do is kind of thinking about wealth inequality broadly and what we can do about it. Issues regarding poverty, issues kind of regarding the wage gap and barriers to economic diversification, the first of which is poverty. And so I want to think about those kinds of issues and bring them to a variety of committees, not just the ones that I stand on.
Senator, what are your priorities?
Well, I think that we still do need to work hard on access to affordable quality health care. And find any way we can to move that forward further. We made nice steps, but it wasn't enough. Medicaid expansion should really be seriously considered. We know that our neighboring states have passed through ballot measures Medicaid expansion. That's perhaps something that we can start the conversation on, since our legislature once again failed to take action on it. I think that's an incredible priority for the people of Wyoming. Other areas in terms of standing committees that I serve on, education, we are going to take a hard look at third grade reading and all the things that bring you there, which as Cathy said includes early childhood education, but K-3 experiences, making sure that all of the students by that end of third grade are reading at performance level, or as many of them as possible. And I'm excited about doing that because I know that that leads to great changes and great outcomes for the students if they're capable of succeeding that year.
As is the majority leadership, you both have been very accessible, not just to me, and I told this to the majority leaders as well, but also to my colleagues, and I very much appreciate
always
your willingness
Anytime.
To visit. What are you going to miss about this place?
This place, nothing. I can't
The
wait
Jonah
until the
building.
Capitol opens. Absolutely.
No.
Yeah.
And in fact, I couldn't believe I did it, but I think I had this whine or moan when I heard that we weren't going to have our interim committee meetings in the new Capitol until the fall. I thought we could start in July. And just the thought of 3 more months here, I was over it.
I can't wait to get back into the Capitol.
It is beautiful from what we have seen.
And honestly, everyone who's watching, all of your viewers should get down to Cheyenne if they can this summer. After, I believe, July 10th is when we'll be opening up, and see what's been done in the restoration. It's incredibly exciting, and it's going to be good to get back home again.
And you'll be proud of it for your grandchildren's grandchildren, honestly.
Committee meetings will change immensely. I believe there'll be room, there'll be comfort, and I'm looking most forward to that.
Absolutely.
To you both again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
And that's a wrap for the final week of Capitol Outlook here in Cheyenne. From all of us at Wyoming PBS, this is a heavy lift for a small station to do this weekly show, but we're happy to do it and we believe it's important. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good evening.
This program is supported in part by a grant from the BNSF Railway Foundation, dedicated to improving the general welfare and quality of life in communities throughout the BNSF Railway service area. Proud to support Wyoming PBS.
And in part by the Wyoming Public Television Endowment and viewers like you.